Downtown Vienna. So behind me and in front of me is the so-called Graben, which is the old part of town, which used to be the moat. Graben is moat. So this was this medieval moat that protected the old center of town in the 1300s. Then it was, of course, filled in and torn down and they built buildings. However, there's something interesting right in front of me. This gorgeous monument in the Graben, pretty much in the center of town, is beautiful, right? It is Baroque and gorgeous, and you can see all these figures and apotheosis, and it is the emperor praying to God, and it looks wonderful with the clouds and angels and all of the beautiful stuff until you reach God, and up there the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove. What does it all mean? It's so gorgeous. Well, in reality, the story behind it is less than gorgeous, because this is the Pestsäule, or the monument of the bubonic plague. People died in the hundreds of thousands, and in the start of the 13th century, 14th century, the plague started coming in from the east in waves, and it overwhelmed Europe over and over again. And that means that people were so desperate they had no solution against the plague that they obviously were left to prayers. And when the plague was finally over, they built these monuments, which you can see across Europe, giving thanks to God for having been saved from the plague. As a matter of fact, European medical knowledge was still stuck in old Greek knowledge. Galen, the old physician of ancient Greek, and then in the Arab world, they took over that knowledge of the four humors. Phlegmatic and this and that and the other. So the water, fine, it's almost like old Chinese medicine. Had nothing to do with reality, but that's why they were down to prayers. In the medieval ages, when the bubonic plague came to town, they used to have these long masks with beaks, and in front of that they had herbs in there to make sure that the air was clean they used to breathe, and so literally long leathery masks with goggles. That's what they looked like. So the interesting thing is that they had literally no wherewithal, and whole countries were barren, literally died out. And the interesting thing behind it is that only in the middle 19th century, modern knowledge came into medicine with a guy called Ignaz Semmelweis, who was, funny enough, a Hungarian Austrian. And he was the first one to say, hey, why don't we start washing our hands before we start even touching patients, and specifically while giving birth to mothers. So he was actually a guy who was an obstetrician who helped mothers give birth. And before that, literally washing your hands, was frowned upon. And that means that he was the first one to say, hey, listen, before we even go and touch anybody, let alone help women give birth, let's go and wash our hands, for which he was literally pillarized by other people and hated by the medical community. But that was the start of modern medicine. So this is not just a beautiful sculpture, it's actually a horrendous reminder of how primitive medical knowledge was in the West, and that they were down to prayers and hope. Another nice story is that there's a famous book by a guy called Boccaccio called Decameron, and that was in the 14th century. The plague came to town in Florence, and the famous book Decameron, which was so debauched that it was forbidden in the US in the early 20th century, is the story of young noblemen and women who escaped from Florence to escape the plague, and they holed up in a country residence outside Florence to actually celebrate life and debauchery before death. That is how the story of Decameron came to be.